Hello, everyone. Again, I'd like to welcome you to our Sunday Bible studies coming to you from University Assembly of God Church here in Waxahachie, Texas. And we're in the middle of a series on lessons from the life of certain Bible characters. And so the first one we did some weeks ago was lessons from the life of the first human family, Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel. And then following that, we did lessons from the life of Enoch and Noah. And now, as of last week, we've started a series on lessons from the life of Job. If you haven't already seen the previous ones of these, they are available to you on our university YouTube. And so I'd like to encourage you to go back and view all those during the week, and then come back and join us again next Sunday for the third one of our studies on the life of Job. Now, last week in our first session on Job, we made the point that Job was we believe that Job was a very real person who lived back at the time of Abraham. And so this is not just a poetical story. It is a poetical story, but it's a poetical story about a real man named Job who went through the things that we're going to study here as we move along. And as I said, he was probably a contemporary of Abraham. He had his wealth was in livestock and land, as it was in the time of Abraham. And he was a priest to his own family, as it was in the time of Abraham. And so most Bible scholars believe that this was in the patriarchal period. Job perhaps lived a little before Abraham, or could have been the same time or a little after, but at that near that time, if you please. According to Job 1:1 and verse 3, he lived in Uz of the east. And Bible scholars are pretty unanimous in their opinion that this was in northern Mesopotamia, east of Palestine. He was very wealthy. He was a very high-ranking official in his community, highly respected, God-fearing, blameless, and righteous. And all these things to know about Job are very, very important. And we also especially noted that Job is one of the most challenging books of the Bible. It's possibly the oldest book of the Bible, and possibly among the very oldest of all ancient writings. And so the language is very, very difficult, and the particular genre of poetry is especially difficult. So, and then, but most of all, the book of Job introduces us to some of the most challenging questions of life. And so this is a really challenging study that we're doing here in the book of Job. But we are sure, I believe, to learn some very important truths from this story about Job. In Job 1:1, we have God's evaluation of Job. And Job 1:1 says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Wouldn't we all like to have that evaluation coming from the mouth of God? And hopefully we will eventually, when he says, well done, thou good and faithful servants. Job was blameless. Again, I emphasize this is God's evaluation. He was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Very notable very, very significant. Fearing God, turning away from evil, blameless, upright. In a word, he was righteous. In fact, this is a very good, solid definition of what we mean by righteousness uh, throughout the Bible and in our own lives. Reverencing God, uh, when we recognize temptation, turn away from evil, so we will be counted blameless and upright in the sight of God, righteous. Um, why? This is a very significant thing when you think about Job when he lived. Why and how was Job righteous when apparently very few at this time were? Uh, the fact of the matter is, uh, most people at this time were very wicked people. How is it that Job was righteous when apparently very few others at his time were? Well, that's a question worth pursuing the answer to. Uh, this brings to mind uh, Enoch and Noah that we have just studied. Enoch uh, was so close to God, he walked with God, and God took him. Uh, when all other men were evil, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord because he feared God and he was like Job. Well, how this happened? We get the answer from Romans chapter 1. And if you have your Bible and want to turn to these verses, that would be very, very good. We're not going to read all of these, but I do want to put a part of this up here on the screen and look at it because it's very important. In Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 28, Paul says these things: that which is known about God is evident within them. Think about this. That which is known about God is evident within them. That is, all of humanity, all human beings. What is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So God reveals himself to every person, every living human being. God has revealed himself to them. He has revealed his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature. These have been clearly seen. Thus, Paul adds, they are without excuse. But they knew God, but they did not honor him as God. Thus, God gave them over to a depraved mind. Now, when Job knew God, he did not dishonor God, but he feared him and turned from evil. So we come again to the question of how then was Job righteous? Well, number one, he knew God. He knew God. And we learn this as we just looked at this in Romans chapter 1. And then second, knowing God, he feared God. He reverenced God. And Paul uses the terminology God honoring. So God fearing in Job 1:1 is the same as God honoring in Romans chapter 1, verse 21. So Job knew God as all men know God from within themselves, as Paul clarifies in Romans chapter 1. And instead of uh, denying the reality of God in sinfulness, Job was was God fearing and turned from evil towards God, turning away from evil and towards God. Whereas most all of humanity turns to evil and away from God. Job turned away from evil and to God. So, like uh, Enoch and Noah before them, now later on in the time of Abraham, Job and Melchizedek are examples of others at that time who were godly aside from the covenant of the law. Now, briefly, you remember probably the story of Melchizedek, which was definitely a contemporary of Abraham. And when Abraham went out to rescue Lot, some kings had come into Sodom and Gomorrah, overtaken them, and taken prisoners. And Lot, uh, Abraham's nephew, was among them. So Abraham gathers his forces and goes out against those other kings and rescues Lot and brings him back. And when he came back, Abraham came back, he met this Melchizedek, who is described as a priest to the Most High God. And so the point here right now is that there were other individuals, and we do not know how many others, possibly others, probably not very many others, but at least some others, because we have not only Abraham, but we have Job and Melchizedek. So these were people who were godly aside from the covenant of the law. Now, think about this. This was without any special written revelation. And I should have really put in there without special written revelation, because the fact of the matter is, God did give special revelation to individuals like Enoch and Noah and Abraham, Job and Melchizedek, because what Paul is talking about at first in Romans chapter 1 is what is called natural revelation. Revelation that is common to all man, all humankind, nature, God revealed in nature, but also God revealed in the conscience of individuals. And so we're going to look at this a little further, and I'll explain a little bit more about the difference between just a general revelation and special revelation. And like I say, I really should have put in here without special written revelation. So if you're making notes, make note of that. So the first lesson from Job is that all human beings know God and can be righteous before him. That is, can be in right relationship with him. God does not withhold this from anyone. All human beings have the same opportunity that Enoch did, and the same opportunity that Noah did. They have the same opportunity that Job did, the same opportunity as Abraham, the same opportunity as Melchizedek. So what happens then? In that Romans chapter 1 passage there, we notice that Paul explains that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Think about the meaning and significance of this. The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Because you see, what we're talking about here is personal progressive revelation, which is available to all. And the way it works is like this. God gives every one a measure of faith, Paul explains later in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. And that's what he's talking about here in Romans chapter 1. This is the measure of faith that God gives to everyone. An inner knowing that there is a God who is a creator and we're the creatures. Every person knows that at some time. And the question is how we respond. And Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, that the usual response is this. Um, uh, men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Isn't that an interesting statement? That men suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The truth is there. The truth is available to us. But if we respond negatively in rebellion against God, as Adam and Eve did, then darkness comes. But so truth is suppressed by rebellion against God. Truth is suppressed in unrighteousness. Truth is suppressed by not fearing God and turning away from evil. Uh, but then the opposite can also happen, that if individuals respond positively in obedience, then they're given more understanding and more faith, and so on and so on. So this is what we believe happened in the case of Enoch, in the case of Noah, in the case of Abraham, Melchizedek, and our person here, Job. These individuals, when they knew God the way that Paul says in Romans chapter 1, when they knew God and his invisible attributes were made known to them, instead of suppressing that in sinfulness and unrighteousness, they responded positively in obedience, and God gave them more understanding and more faith. And as I said, then this continues. And so this personal progressive revelation is what's happening here. And that's how Job came to know about God and to be the righteous man that he was. And now let's move on here after God's evaluation of Job in chapter 1, verse 1, right off. Then let's look at, continue to look and see about who Job is. Well, Job's family, verse 2. He had, of course, he had a wife, and he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his wife. Job's wealth. Verse 3 says his possessions included 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, or 1,000 oxen, yoke being 2, 500 female donkeys. Wow, that's a total of 11,500 animals. Folks, that is a huge farm. That is a huge ranch, if you please. Just think of the acreage and the employees that would be needed to run this operation. Job couldn't do all that himself. He had to have many, many servants, and he had to have different levels of authority people. He had to have people that he knew he could depend upon to take care of the sheep, to see to it that they had pasture, and the camels that they had pasture, and the female donkeys and the oxen. That's a huge, huge ranch, a huge operation with individuals overseeing that, shearing the sheep and tending to the sheep and the camels and the oxen and the donkeys when they're giving birth. And this is a huge operation with multiple levels of employees that would be needed. This is extremely significant. So In what ways then was Job the greatest of all the men of the East? That's what God says of him in the last part of verse 3. Job, the greatest of all the men of the East. Well, he was, what we're talking about here is Job's influence in his community. So, in what specific ways did he have this influence? In what specific ways, ways was Job then the greatest of all the men of the East? Well, number one, he was most likely, if not the most wealthy. He was very close. And in fact, I think that very few people would have this kind of wealth that Job has here, all the acreage that would be necessary, and all these animals, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, and 500 female donkeys. It's very unlikely that there was anyone who was more wealthy. Abraham, I don't believe, ever accumulated that kind of wealth. So he was probably the wealthiest man. And think of his economic influence with his wealth, all the people that he hired to give oversight and care for all of these animals. And he was a trader. Why did he have all those sheep? Well, it was for the wool, and he was an exporter of these goods, if you please. And then his leadership and political influence. We look ahead to Job chapter 29 for that, but you can imagine from his wealth. But Job later bemoans the fact that he no longer had this, so we know about what kind of influence he had. We talked about this last week. He was a leader in the community, a prince. He was a person that everybody looked up to, everybody respected, everybody looked to him for advice and understanding. So he was very, very influential in his leadership and political influence. But most of all, Job was the greatest of all the men of the East, quite possibly in his commitment and obedience to God, because later it's going to be Job that God brings to the attention of Satan. And we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but his commitment and obedience to God is unexcelled and greatest among the men of the East. And I think these are probably the three things that God has in mind when it's told that Job was the greatest man of the East. Now, the next thing is where the drama begins. In Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, the conversation that goes on in heaven between God and Satan and about Job. So let's look at this. Now, this is right after God, the book of Job tells about Job and his family and his wealth. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where did you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. Then the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Reading verses 6 through 12 in Job chapter 1. The sons of God. Well, there are multiple places where this term is used, and we're not going to take time to get into the discussion of all those, but it's pretty apparent here that most likely this is talking about angels, and apparently both good and evil angels. And so we have this very unique picture here in the book of Job that we see nothing like it anywhere else in Scripture, where there is a meeting, if you please, in the heavenlies with, quote unquote, the sons of God, God meeting with the angels. And the phraseology is that they presented themselves before the Lord. For what? Well, I think that God continues to hold all the angels accountable to him, and he expects them to report. And so some believe that this was a regular occurrence, that from time to time God would have a meeting with all of the angels, and as we said, both good and evil angels. So here is a very interesting insight that we get here, that Satan's access to God. And as I've just been discussing, whether or not this was regular or occasional, and of course we don't really know. The book, what we have here in the book of Job, doesn't really make it certain for us. It's quite possible that God commands all of them to come in sometime, or perhaps on some regular basis, but possibly not. We don't know for sure. But again, I'd like to emphasize again in verse 8, God's own evaluation of Job's righteousness. He told Satan, consider my servant Job, no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then this conversation goes from interesting to even more interesting here in verses 6 through 12, where Satan accuses God concerning Job and boasts, and Satan asks God this question: does Job fear God for nothing? Now, what does that mean? That's verse 9. Does Job fear God for nothing? What does that mean? Well, it means this. I'd phrase it as something, I'd phrase Satan's intended meaning here something like this. With your protection, Job doesn't really need to fear you. You got your hedge about him. He doesn't really need to fear you. Everything's fine and well. And in fact, he probably doesn't really even fear you. You protect him. He doesn't need you. He probably doesn't really fear you. And Job says, put forth your hand on him, he'll curse you to your face. So in verses 8 and 12, God gives Satan permission to test Job. And by doing this, God himself puts Job in the center of a challenge between God himself and Satan. So you have you have God on the one hand, you have Satan on the other hand, and in between is Job. And so, again, by giving Satan permission that he's going to give him here, he puts Job right in the middle of this conflict. And what we're talking about is a cosmic battle between good and evil. And we see this being the case from the very beginning of the creation. When God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, there is immediately this cosmic battle comes into view, a cosmic battle between good and evil that is still going on today and getting extremely intense today. In fact, a cosmic power struggle between God and Satan, with Job being like a dispensable pawn on the chessboard of life. There we have it pictured. God on one hand, Satan on the other, and man in the middle. This was the case of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Uh, that's what was happening there. And unfortunately, Adam and Eve did not stand the test. And Satan won that battle, and we're experiencing the results of that ever since. This was what was happening with Jesus in the wilderness. After his baptism by John, we have the cosmic battle of good and evil going on here. And this time, Jesus withstood the temptation, contrary to Adam and Eve. Jesus withstood the temptation, rebuked the devil. And again, in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prays, Father, isn't there some way other way we can do this and take this cup from me? But he says, not my will, but thine be done. And then on the cross, he hangs in there all the way, and he overcomes any temptation to call 10,000 angels. And so we have Job here in Edom, and so we have another picture here. And Job represents all of humanity, that we find ourselves in the middle of this cosmic battle between good and evil. And the interesting conclusion here is that God's ultimate victory over evil needs human cooperative participation. And we'll have to put that off and discuss that more in subsequent sessions. But we're so glad you joined us, and we have something here to really look forward to in the coming sessions. So tell your friends and get other people to come in and join us and see what lessons we're going to learn here. God bless you. Have a good week.